I grew up on a family farm not too far from here in Collins. So being in a small town, the community and my church were positive influences from a young age. We attended the United Methodist Church there regularly, where my mom taught Sunday school and music most of my life. My granddad was an elder and the treasurer, seemingly always leading committees or volunteers to keep the church maintained and operational. As I followed him around the farm, soaking up any life skills or lessons I could, he became an integral mentor in my life. I often joined him and my dad whenever there were opportunities to serve or volunteer at the church, the Legion, or anywhere else in the community. With my granddad as my faith mentor, I went through Bible study and confirmation classes, ultimately being saved and accepting Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior at 12 or 13 years old. It was during those studies that the Bible stories I'd been taught as a child they were transformed into real life. It was clicking for me that the stories and illustrations from my childhood weren't fictitious characters, but rather God's own word. I realized for the first time that my sins, no matter how small I perceived them, from telling stories or lying or using profanity, disobeying my parents, they prevented my salvation, and that God sent his only Son to die on the cross and wash away those sins, granting me a path to heaven. During the years that followed, we didn't have a youth program of any sort, so I just continued to emulate my granddad and the elders of the church, focusing mostly on acts of service and trying to be a good kid. In a small town where news of you rolling a stop sign or squealing your tires beats you home, I kept it pretty straight and narrow and never really went off the rails. As I began my freshman year at Iowa State, I attended Salt Company and a few other campus faith events that talked about having an active relationship with Jesus. At the time, it struck me that I had primarily experienced an omnidirectional faith growing up, one that I listened to or related to the sermons, but never really let them alter my path or move me to spread his word. The next few years, I let the hustle and bustle of college and Saturday night socialization take priority over getting involved in those campus ministries or regularly attending Sunday services. I often gave thanks for all my blessings, but never really relinquished full control to God to steer my day-to-day activities or major life decisions. Even though I thought my decisions were my choice at the time and were driven by my analytical mind or mitigating risk, I look back and realize how blind I was to God bringing people and events into my life to help shape it. Not super long after I met Spencer, I had a divine clarity that amongst all her qualities and attractiveness, her Christian upbringing and values were the most wife-worthy attributes that would one day help shape our family. Soon after, I moved to Minnesota with a 2 to 3 year plan of staying in the big city and then moving back. 2 years became 5, then 7. During that time, Spencer and I attended a few different churches, but never really found one that we were comfortable calling ours. After Blair and Paige were born, we were both convicted to raise our children in a Christian home, surrounded by and drawing influence from a church family like we'd both experienced growing up. About 4 years ago, Spencer began attending a Thursday women's Bible study that resulted in the formation of a small group, and that's where I found myself re-immersed in my faith again, surrounded by other Christians at various points in their ongoing faith journeys. Open and vulnerable discussions at those small groups and some particularly relatable sermons on Sundays reopened my eyes to living every day in faith and allowing God to steer our busy lives rather than making time for faith on Sundays, as many of us did. While letting the rat race and jobs and kids and events control the rest of the week and then showing up on Sunday. So kind of putting him first, so to say. One sermon that sticks with me that altered my view of faith, and as I had known it my whole life, was focused on the path to salvation not necessarily being through the goodness of my heart or acts that I was doing, but rather truly submitting to God that every one of us is an ongoing sinner, no matter the lengths we go to be good or serve in the community. Attempting to stay on the straight and narrow and always being ready to lend a helping hand aren't necessarily bad ways to live, but realizing and confessing my sins allowed me to open my heart to a personal relationship with God that created a dependence on his guidance. God also opened my heart to the importance of outreach and spreading his word, showing the work that can be done through him by allowing him to be the steward of our resources and time. The last few years, I felt like I finally put down roots and found my church home in Minnesota, pursuing an active relationship with Jesus for the first time. one that is growing as my faith and need for him continues to deepen. When we uprooted and moved to Polk City this spring, finding a new church where we could continue that journey became one of Spencer and I's most talked about worries. God led us to Lakeside, and I feel like we didn't miss a beat jumping into starting point and then finding our new growth group. That brings us to tonight. Although I was technically baptized with a sprinkle as a toddler and accepted Jesus as my Savior in my youth, I want to reaffirm my obedience to God as an adult and man of faith through immersive baptism, just as Jesus himself was baptized.